On this week's 51%, we speak with journalist Katie Simon about navigating sex and relationships after sexual assault and how the road to healing can look different for each person.
Be patient with yourself. You can move through it. It's just, it takes time.
We also hear from the New York County clerk who was recently sued by Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton for refusing to file a summary judgment against an abortion provider in New York. I'm Jesse King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing Shiloh leader. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jesse King. Our main guest today has spent years researching how women and men move forward after trauma. Katie Simon is a journalist specializing in sexuality whose writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, BuzzFeed, and Women's Health. A lot of their job involves interviewing survivors of sexual assault, and it's a topic that Simon is intimately familiar with, being a survivor themselves. RAINN estimates that in the U.S., sexual assault occurs once every 68 seconds, impacting 1 in 6 women and 1 in 33 men. While things like the Me Too movement may have encouraged people to speak up about trauma, Simon notes there still isn't a lot of discussion about how that trauma can impact the rest of a survivor's life, especially when it comes to sex and relationships. When looking for books on the subject in the aftermath of their own assault, Simon says they came up empty, and so they set out to make that book themselves. Tell Me What You Like serves as part guide, part healing companion, so to speak, with dozens of survivors' stories about how they personally found healing after trauma. Simon says there's really no one road to recovery. While the book is frank in its discussions about sex, we as a public radio program don't go there. Still, this conversation is about sexual assault. If that is something that's upsetting for you to hear right now, this is probably not the interview for you, and that's okay. I think it's also important to note that this conversation is starting from the point where a survivor is now safe and has escaped their abuser and is not still perhaps in a relationship with them or within reach of them. If you or someone you love has been impacted by sexual assault, help is available. RAINN has its National Sexual Assault Hotline open 24/7 at 1-800-656-HOPE. Its website is RAINN, that's RAINN.org.
I heard survivors talking about how there's no conversation around this, even on an interpersonal level with friends, loved ones, partners, therapists. So I heard there's this lack of conversation. And then I heard so many survivors talking about wanting to share their story or set boundaries or claim their needs. And survivors, didn't necessarily feel like they had the tools to do that when it specifically came to issues related to sex and relationships and dating after sexual assault. Like, you can go through CPT for PTSD, like this whole trauma therapy regimen, and tackle stuff around trust and safety and control, but it's never necessarily applied directly to somebody's sex life or sexuality. And because there's not that kind of conversation, survivors are sort of going around operating mostly through trial and error, which is a really scary way to operate and totally unnecessary given how many people face these same issues. So we really need more conversation, more stories. And I always tell people, and it's really true, that most of the time, if you have a book coming out in the month leading up to it, you're like watching, waiting to see if somebody publishes something similar or that might sort of like take away from your audience. I just am like, I want there to be 100 books published simultaneously on this issue, tackling it from different perspectives. And like, just the more conversation, the better. So I had a very weird attitude going into this.
Well, on that front, from your conversations with survivors, I guess how did they see sexual assault impacting their relationships, their love lives and sex lives?
Well, it's really individual and personal. And, one person might be affected by really like limiting a certain behavior or minimizing that in their sex life or relationship, while another survivor might literally want to do more of that. Like, and both answers are, perfectly healthy and good and like good for them. In the research process for my book, I was coming across a lot of issues where a lot of survivors were tackling the same issue in a very different way. We could take like relationship communication. One woman I spoke to her a couple of times over a number of years, and she remained steadfast in not ever sharing her trauma story with her. Eventually, he became her husband, and like wanted zero communication about that. And then I found other people who wanted to like regularly talk about how that was impacting their relationship. And they would want to talk about that, at any time, maybe every day, maybe, whenever it came up. And then I had people who struggled to sort of like do that initial communication with the partner. And it might even take years into the relationship to go there. But then after that, it became like a lot easier and they developed a shared language. So there's just so many different ways to tackle something. And I'm a journalist, not like a therapist or healthcare worker or something. My job is to sort of take these stories and represent them to other people. And when there were so many different opinions and ways of doing things, I presented all of them. And my book, I think, kind of feels like a discussion for that reason, because there's so many different perspectives on the same thing. And survivors, like, even though they weren't actually on the same Zoom call, they would kind of end up in conversation on the page. So it's a really sort of lovely way of presenting a lot of options to survivors that are sort of maybe still figuring out what they even want.
Yeah, how do you decide what you want? It sounds like you said a lot of trial and error.
There's actually a whole chapter in the book on that. It's kind of a journey and there is trial and error, but the goal is with this book that maybe you can kind of read about a few ways, learn about a few ways of approaching something, and get a sense of which one you want to try so that it doesn't have to be literally like you have no advice, like no sort of basis to make a strategy of how you want to tackle something. But actually instead for you to have lots of options available and also feel less pressure. Like if this way doesn't work, it's not the only way. There are other ways to achieve the same goal.
I imagine it can feel scary or difficult to figure out your wants and boundaries or even process this trauma when you're also in a relationship. There's another person in the equation here. How did you see survivors having that conversation with their partner of like, hey, this is what happened to me, if they even do have that conversation? Because as you said, some people will choose to avoid it completely.
A lot of survivors have found ways to communicate with partners that are based around needs and boundaries and not just like sort of sharing the details of their trauma story right away. Because there's not anything inherently wrong with sharing a trauma story, but if you're a partner, if you think about it from that perspective, if somebody says this horrible thing happened to me, this is what happened, and sort of leaves the conversation there, that's like a pretty tough position for a partner to be in, to help sort of guide them through like what to do about this story, what to do with this information. Like survivors often have kind of unexpressed needs or, boundaries that they, want help enforcing, and telling a little part of your story, but then explaining how it relates to, oh, I don't like being touched like that. And like this story is why. So in the future, could you avoid touching me in that place? Like that is a really effective use of a trauma disclosure. I've heard from a bunch of survivors, and like personally, I've heard from a bunch of partners that just telling a story with no kind of to-do list or like no action item is really hard and not necessarily building towards like a healthier relationship. It's just sort of like hanging there and people don't know what to do with it. So like making it be about an action a partner can take is really helpful. And I always recommend survivors, partners, really like everybody put themselves in the position of being the partner to a trauma survivor. So if survivors have more empathy for partners and maybe are able to see more about like what could be difficult about being in that position, I think that's like a very helpful tool towards like more empathy and better communication.
Yeah, with that in mind, for partners, what did you hear from partners about what they did to help survivors feel respected and safe?
Yeah, so first of all, definitely like ask the survivor directly because there is so much variability in what people want and need. And believe them then when they say that's what they want and need. And be open to it being kind of an ongoing conversation, like how people experience the fallout of trauma, whether that's PTSD symptoms or sort of like changes to their life. It changes over time. So if you're somebody's partner, what they might need from you at the beginning of the relationship could be really different than what they need from you like 2 years later. And it's important to check in about that to like keep the communication going. All of this stuff can be scary to survivors. It might not look scary to a partner, like if somebody is just like having a hard time with sex or communication or something. But it can actually be like physiologically scary to survivors. So partners can really make a big difference in that sort of scary moment by being there for them. So it's important to be sort of tuned into what a survivor needs. And I'll say it again, but like sort of the only way to really know that is to ask. So it might feel a little awkward, but it's better to just say, hey, like, I noticed you seem to be freezing up, or like, I noticed you were freezing up yesterday. Is there something I could do that would help you with that in the moment? And just having those little conversations over time.
Your book goes into the different types of consent, like legal consent versus relational or embodied consent, I think it's also called. Thinking back to my sex ed classes in school growing up, I'm not even sure we had lessons on like different types of consent. I'm pretty sure I was just told about like the one growing up. So what are these different types?
Legal consent is like, the FBI definition of like rape. And if you don't ask like verbal permission and get a yes or a no, and like it's sort of something designed to help prevent and punish crimes. Whereas the more relational kinds of consent are actually about making sex better, like preventing crimes, yes, but like also making sex better. So there's embodied consent, which you mentioned. And a lot of survivors I spoke to really liked that. It's the idea that, sort of in addition to any verbal communication, you learn to read each other's body language. So that might be like if you start sort of staring off into space and not being very responsive, that's a time for your partner to pause and check in. Or it might be like your hands are scrunched up or something like that. That's actually a sign of pleasure, and that is something to keep going. And sort of learning to read these body language cues can be really helpful to survivors who might struggle with just like being present in the moment. And if you add on the responsibility of verbally communicating everything that you feel and want in the moment, that can kind of take survivors out of the moment. Whereas this embodied consent is more about reading each other and might be a better fit for some survivors. But on the other hand, like some survivors really like the yes, no, like affirmative consent, or like enthusiastic consent where you get, a yes for everything. And some survivors like that is their preferred consent style. But it was interesting learning how many survivors spoke about embodied consent, which is not a brand new concept by any means. But how it works for sexual assault survivors and like why it works well for them. I think that's a really cool thing to study and put some attention on.
This might be an obvious question, but to your point that this isn't talked about a lot, why do we have such a hard time talking about this, about the aftermaths of sexual assault? The Me Too movement may have helped make it a little less taboo to acknowledge, I guess, but we've still got a long way to go.
I think we really struggle with the idea of sexual assault survivors being like full people and not just victims or just like survivors or like having everything related to trauma. And that comes up a lot in the work that I've done, because a lot of people will be, into something sexually that isn't necessarily what they were doing before they were assaulted, but sometimes they're saying, like, oh, well, this is because I was assaulted, and so I started doing this certain thing. But a lot of the time, they'll say, like, I think I would have been doing this anyway, and like I, was on a certain path before I was assaulted, and maybe I'm still kind of on that path. So there's different answers to how trauma affects us and affects us sexually, and different people feel different ways about it. But yeah, I think that like we have a hard time talking about sexual assault still just because like we didn't really like we kind of like announced that there was a problem, but it's sort of like what I just said about you have to, not just tell your story, but like state your needs, state your boundaries, state what you want to happen as a result of telling your story. I think like with Me Too, it was more about just saying the story. And so now we haven't really gone through the like what needs to happen next. And I see my work as very much part of it. It's also tied into kind of what sex ed needs to look like because some survivors spoke to me very eloquently about sort of the idea that sex ed that they had in high school, which sex ed's like notorious for being bad, basically. But they said like they didn't even mention sexual assault, let alone like what to do after you're sexually assaulted. There's sort of no guidance, and a lot of survivors are still operating pretty alone. And I actually always recommend to people like if you feel like the people in your life are not sort of supportive enough or you don't have that many people in your life, you can still access community by going to peer-led survivor groups or even calling hotlines or just joining some new social like club kind of thing just to get exposure to more people. But there's always something you can do to have more social support and have more community. And like if your community is not really meeting your needs, like you can always sort of choose yourself.
That actually touches on my next question for you. What resources are out there for survivors to help process their trauma or navigate sex and dating? It sounds like support groups are good to look out for. Is this something that therapy has helped with for the survivors that you interviewed?
Yeah, so I actually think it's really important for sexual assault survivors to know that most therapists, like really like the majority of therapists, like trauma therapists or talk therapists, are not specifically trained around sex after sexual assault at all. And some sex therapists have some training related to sex and trauma, but I just heard from a sex therapist last night who was saying like, yeah, we had that short class, but like it wasn't about sex after sexual assault. It was just sort of about trauma, like a general kind of class about trauma. So I think it's really important that people know if they feel like their therapist isn't really helping them with this, it's because it's like a systemic issue. And like to not feel bad like you have the wrong therapist or you're not like explaining yourself well, like it's sort of a universal problem. And I only came across that fact because I was working on this book. I mean, I had many therapists that I felt like did not address sex after sexual assault really like at all. One just told me to just join a dating app and I would be healed like almost verbatim. So yeah, there's not that much help with that. And I think there's a lot of power in what you said of the peer-led support groups. Because there's a lot of sort of power dynamics about who owns the story of sexual assault and like who like has the right to kind of like correct what you say. And when somebody's more like a gatekeeper or has power over you, sometimes that conversation can be a little funky. But when it's a peer group, I've personally joined some of those and I found them to be very helpful with like a little warning that some of those groups actually for survivors explicitly do not allow discussion about sex. And it's to keep some people comfortable, but the effect it has is that there's sort of nowhere to go. That's actually something I'd love to start is just like not even really a support group, just like a group where it's like that is an okay topic to talk about like casually. Like that is something like just how you might come in and say, "Oh, my boss like said this thing and it really stressed me out." You should be able to go in there and say like, "Oh, I have this new partner and I was trying to explain my boundaries to him and like he just did not get it at all and I had a total panic attack." So like I think there needs to be room for those conversations and hopefully also some of that can be with people like friends. But friends, are like therapists aren't trained, friends are not trained, like friends are learning by doing. So it's sort of hit or miss.
Well, just in all aspects of our day-to-day lives, how can we practice vocalizing our wants or to play off the title of your book, telling people what we like?
Yeah. Yeah, I named my book Tell Me What You Like, sort of to evoke that sort of tell me what you don't like, which I think is so commonly asked of survivors. But tell me what you like is like, what is the good stuff? What are you into? What do you like? And in our daily lives, I think that's almost like a great practice ground for more intense situations that, maybe like having sex with someone or going out with someone or something that feels higher stakes. Yeah, I think just like prioritizing pleasure, because that's like something that we're not really taught to do, but if you do it, it feels amazing. And when I talk about pleasure, I'm not just saying sexual pleasure, I'm saying like doing things that just feel really good to you, or like sensory things that just feel really good to you, and sort of packing your life with that. Like that's something you don't need other people's permission for. And then if you're talking about like asking for what you want from another person, I think there sometimes is this like myth that like sexual assault survivors, like if they like work up the nerve to ask for what we want, like people should give it to us, but that's not true. Like these are interpersonal relationships where there's at least one other person. And so you have to navigate that just like everyone else, like balancing people's needs and boundaries, and also paying attention, I think, to deal breakers. Like if you're asking for something that's really important to you and that person is just like, no, I can't provide you with that, it's okay to walk away. I noticed in interviewing survivors that many of them were afraid to break up with somebody if they felt like that person did like a decent job at sort of handling trauma. So they would really not want to break up. But the truth is there's like so many people out there that can meet your needs or maybe better aligned. So knowing what your deal breakers are and when it's time to like stop trying to make that conversation work in a certain relationship, like that's really important too.
Katie, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us. Is there anything that you hope readers most take away from your book?
Well, I hope they buy it and read it or check it out from the library. It's hard to explain like how many different perspectives there are in this book. It's very diverse and very diverse in life experience. I really just emphasize all these things are kind of individual, and if you have had one experience with a sexual assault survivor, or you've had one experience with sexual assault and something happens again, or you start dating that person, a different person again, it can be a whole other ball game. And to just be patient with yourself, like you can move through it's just it takes time. And I just think like really anybody could benefit from reading it, not even just survivors, partners, or their therapists. I think therapists would like so far have loved this book. I just think it's sort of, as we started out talking about, it's like not really talked about at all. And so actually, reading it is sort of the first step towards having that conversation. Yeah, and I really appreciate your this opportunity to come on and talk more about it. I love talking about this.
Katie Simon is a journalist specializing in sexuality and the author of Tell Me What You Like, an honest discussion of sex and intimacy after sexual assault. It's out now through Citadel Press, and you can learn more about Simon's work at katiesimon.com. Katie, thanks again.
Thank you.
And again, if you or someone you love has been impacted by sexual assault, RAINN has its National Sexual Assault Hotline open 24/7 at 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-HOPE. And its website is RAINN, that's RAINN.org. A few updates on some stories we've been following here at 51%. First off, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton has filed a lawsuit against a New York County clerk for repeatedly refusing to file a summary judgment against a New York doctor who prescribed abortion pills to a Texas patient via telehealth. Paxton first sued Dr. Margaret Carpenter of New Paltz, New York, in a civil court last year for allegedly violating Texas's abortion ban. Texas prohibits nearly all abortions, but New York has refused to cooperate with Texas in accordance with its SHIELD law, which protects abortion providers from out-of-state lawsuits. When Carpenter failed to respond to the suit, a Texas judge issued a permanent injunction and a more than $100,000 fine against her, but that still hasn't been carried out. Twice, acting Ulster County Clerk Taylor Brook says he has received orders from Paxton to file the judgment against Carpenter in New York, but he won't do it.
Since everything that the doctor did was legal in New York State, she never left New York State, our interpretation of the SHIELD law made it pretty clear that we were not to comply with it, and so we rejected it based on that. Nothing has changed on our end. The law hasn't changed from our perspective. We are still not to comply with anything like this.
Paxton, a Republican, is now seeking a writ of mandamus in New York to force Brook to file the judgment. In a statement, he says Carpenter is a, quote, radical abortionist who must face justice, not get legal protection from New York liberals intent on ending the lives of as many unborn children as they can, end quote. The case is considered the first major test of SHIELD laws protecting abortion providers in the U.S. New York is one of 8 states with such laws. Opponents say they are unconstitutional and that states are required to respect the laws and rulings of other states. Legal experts like Mary Ziegler, a law professor from UC Davis, say it's possible the matter will make its way to the Supreme Court.
It's definitely something we've expected to see. This is a question about states' rights, right? And when states have to listen to one another.
The Texas case isn't the only one Carpenter faces. She's been indicted on criminal charges in Louisiana for allegedly prescribing abortion pills there. New York has refused to extradite Carpenter in that case. Carpenter has largely refused to comment on the lawsuits, but the Abortion Coalition for Telemedicine, which Carpenter co-founded, has stressed in its statements that the 2-pill regimen for medicated abortions is a, quote, essential part of women's health care that has been proven safe and effective globally for decades, end quote. Democratic New York Governor Kathy Hochul blasted Paxton's lawsuit in a statement, calling it pathetic and dangerous. New York has amped up its laws protecting abortion providers in recent months, allowing doctors to now list their practice instead of their names on prescription labels. As for Brook, he says he's not sure what to expect going forward. He says county and state lawyers are likely to get involved, especially if the case is appealed, and he's retaining an attorney for himself.
It's a bit of a whirlwind today, a little frustrating. Ken Paxton's press release talked about how radical liberals in New York are trying to kill as many babies as possible, and I now have a daughter who's 3 months old, and that's extremely offensive to me that they would frame the decision that we made as trying to intentionally kill children. It's just completely absurd. We're trying to protect doctors. That's what we're doing.
Elsewhere in reproductive health news, on Monday, July 28th, a federal judge in Boston ruled Planned Parenthood clinics nationwide must continue to be reimbursed for Medicaid funding. The nation's largest abortion provider is currently fighting the Trump administration over efforts to defund it in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. A provision in that law instructed the federal government to end Medicaid payments to abortion providers that received more than $800,000 from Medicaid in 2023. Even those who also offer medical services like birth control, pregnancy tests, and STD testing. Planned Parenthood says the law effectively singles them out and could cause nearly 200 of their clinics to close. Attorneys general in 22 states plus the District of Columbia have also filed a lawsuit over the provision. Thanks for listening to this week's 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jesse King. Our associate producer is Madeline Reynolds, and our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. Just a reminder that you can listen to 51% anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can stay in the loop on all of WAMC's shows by signing up for our weekly newsletter, Airwaves, at WAMC.org. We hope you'll join us next week. Until then, I'm Jesse King for 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. The nightmare down the hallway, I had to learn how to look away. I lost my cool